Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics315. Today's interview is with Doug Geivett. His interests are the areas of philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, epistemology, and the history of modern philosophy. And he is the professor of philosophy of religion and ethics at Talbot School of Theology and Biola University. Doug is also the author of Evil and the Evidence for God and co-editor of Contemporary Perspectives on Religious Epistemology and In Defense of Miracles, a comprehensive case for God's action in history. He's also written Faith, Film, and Philosophy and has also contributed chapters to a number of other books listed at today's blog post. In our interview today, I'll be asking Doug about his background in philosophy and apologetics, the subject of miracles, and advice to Christian apologists. So thanks for joining me today, Doug.
Thank you, Brian, for inviting me.
Would you mind telling our listeners more about yourself and your background?
All right. I teach in the Talbot Department of Philosophy, a graduate program in philosophy at the Biola University in Southern California. I've been there for 17 years. My education began in a Bible college in Portland, Oregon, now called Multnomah University. And from there, I went to study with Norman Geisler at Dallas Theological Seminary, where I was encouraged by him to continue work in Christian apologetics and philosophy. Along the way, I studied at Gonzaga University, a Jesuit college in Spokane, Washington, while I was ministered to college students in a church nearby. And in 1985, I wrote my thesis for that program and completed my last year study at Dallas Theological Seminary, and then went the fall of 1985 to the University of Southern California, where I did my PhD in philosophy, working with Dallas Willard, who is well known not only as a Christian scholar, but also for work that he's done in Christian philosophy and apologetics as well. I taught for 2 years at Taylor University in Indiana before coming to Biola University. So that pretty well summarizes my educational background and my professional experience after your having mentioned the various things that I've written about.
Now, you did mention Geisler and Willard, but what other authors or thinkers do you think have had the most influence on you?
Well, I do credit Norm Geisler for having inspired my interest in Christian apologetics and provided me with the best resources initially for working through questions of my own and being able to respond to people with whom, I had in-depth conversations, mostly undergraduate faculty at a secular university. So that was a substantial formative experience for me, just reading his work before even meeting him. And then, of course, Dallas Willard. In the area of Christian apologetics, I have just had the privilege of knowing personally many contemporary apologists, and so in addition to reading their work, the work of William Lane Craig, for example, and being close personal friends with them, they've also informed my thinking quite a lot. One philosopher and Christian apologist that is not as well known, though he should be better known, is Stuart Hackett, who for so many years was at Wheaton College and who unfortunately I've never met. But he wrote a book called Reconstructing the Christian Revelation Claim, and that, I believe, is a first-rate book. It's technical and difficult, but very systematic. And we'll be talking about that, I suspect, in the course of this dialogue. Another is Richard Swinburne, who hosted me at Oxford University during a sabbatical I did there as a visiting scholar. And his work also is very systematic in the area of natural theology. And though we differ in methodology in some fundamental ways, some of the basic components in building the case for Christian theism are similar between our respective views. And so I'd say that those two, Hackett and Swinburne, together have done as much as anybody to influence my view of how to bring the total case for Christian belief into proper perspective with maximum strength.
Now, you mentioned your educational history there and your different influences, but at core, what interests you in philosophy and what interests you in apologetics? What's sort of your motivation behind pursuing those things, and what are the areas that you like to focus on?
Okay, well, that's great. That's a great question, and I'd say two things in particular, maybe three. One is that it's personal for me. I believe that it's important for each one of us to have confidence in what we believe if we're going to manage the challenges of life from the point of view of faith. We've got to have not only clarity on what we believe, but on why we believe it. And so it's a matter of personal concern that I have confidence in what I believe, and that began for me very early on. I mean, even in junior high and high school, I was concerned with those kinds of questions and felt that I would not be very effective in Christian service if I couldn't work from a point of view of comparatively strong confidence that Christianity is true. And by comparatively strong confidence, I mean that confidence in comparison with what other people can say on behalf of competing worldviews. One of the things I ask Christians who struggle with doubt and with non-belief oftentimes is, what would you believe instead? If not Christianity, then what? And that has always been for me a critical question for surveying the alternatives and coming back to Christianity as the most plausible worldview. So it's personal. The second for me is that if we're to engage the culture in the right way, in the spirit of the New Testament and in the spirit of Christ, then I think we have to be able to appeal to the minds of men as well as to their hearts. And it really is on both fronts that Christianity proves to be so compelling. My view about culture war rhetoric is that maybe it's overdone, that we need to be thinking of ourselves more in New Testament terms as ministers of reconciliation who seek to understand the concerns that people have and really sympathize with their questions, even their objections, but then have something appropriate to say in response because we've thought about them carefully and it's not just something canned that comes out of a book or from a set of notes. And so that's been my passion, is to be prepared for that myself and to prepare others for that kind of engagement with the world out of a concern as ministers of reconciliation between men who need the truth and God who is the God of truth.
Do you find that your study in philosophy enriches your walk with God and your work in theology?
Well, yes. For me personally, it does. And I'm really not sure how I would manage without, how I would continue with the confidence that I do have if I didn't have definite evidences to appeal to. Now, I can't speak for other people. I know that other people feel confident without being able to marshal evidences and develop evidences, and I certainly don't believe that everybody should have a detailed education in Christian apologetics or a PhD in philosophy or the sciences or anything like that to have a confident faith. But we are all different, and in my case, because I'm a reader and I'm a thinker and I work in the world of ideas so much, I have to devote more of my time for my own mind to be satisfied. I have to devote more of my time to being clear about what the issues are, what the challenges are, what potential defeaters exist for the rationality of Christian belief, and to be satisfied that we've got defeaters for those potential defeaters for Christian belief, that we've got ways of responding to objections. And of course, if I'm going to be a representative of our tradition and work in the academy and in the world of other philosophers and knowledge experts, so-called, then I have to be sort of up to speed on those things in ways that I know other people don't have to because of the way God has called them differently. But then my goal is to be a resource for them as well, so that they can have confidence that there are people that are doing that kind of work on behalf of the church.
Mm-hmm. Now, kind of shifting gears here, I mentioned at the beginning of the interview that one of your books, which you co-edited with Gary Habermas, is In Defense of Miracles. So I want to ask you a few questions about that subject. But before I do, could you briefly sketch out what the goal of that book is?
Oh, yeah, sure. The book, In Defense of Miracles, was really Gary's idea to begin with, and he had been playing around with the idea for a while and had talked to several potential contributors about doing a book on this topic. He and I were discussing it, and we decided to join forces and add some contributors, and then he and I would sort of divide responsibilities with the contributors that we each knew better. And so we decided that we would organize the book around Humean, David Hume, of course, being the famous skeptic of the 18th century, who has had the greatest influence the greatest influence in critiquing the supernatural and miracles even up to the present generation. So we wanted to have something that was an up-to-date response to the kind of current neo-Humean critique of miracles. And so we included his original essay on miracles at the front of the book so that it provided context, and then we invited Anthony Flew, who at that time was one of the best-known skeptics and atheists, really, to write an update of his own critique of supernaturalism in the the neo-Humean tradition.
Mm-hmm.
He agreed to do that, and then we invited various other contributors to respond with different points of focus. So we had a chapter on the arguments for the existence of God. We had chapters on how to define a miracle, how to identify a miracle, what counts as evidence that a miracle has happened, what kind of evidence a miracle provides for other things that we believe, specific chapters on the resurrection of Jesus, the incarnation and two natures of Christ, fulfilled prophecy, the appearances of Jesus, things like that. So it was an attempt to provide a comprehensive case for God's continuing action in history, but in particular through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which provides such a fundamental point of reference for understanding Christianity as a gospel and for understanding the rationality of belief that Christianity is true. So our goal was achieved, I believe, as soon as I heard from Anthony Flew himself, this great critic who had agreed to contribute a chapter. Once he received the book in the mail, finished book in the mail, he wrote me and he said that he thought it was now the standard work. It would be the work that needed to be read by people to be up to date on all the arguments that were being discussed, both Humean, neo-Humean, and then on the other side, in response to that critique. So that suggested to me that we had accomplished our goals.
Well, excellent. And it seems it does follow the same sort of pattern as In Defense of Natural Theology by Doug Grotice. So I suppose if anyone wants to read up on responses to David Hume, they could get both those books and be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, I think you're right. In fact, I think that book by Grotice and Sennett it's a follow-up to our book. It came out a few years later. It's structured in much the same way. It's called In Defense of Natural Theology, so the title even resembles the title In Defense of Miracles. So they are great companion volumes. It happens that several of the contributors to our volume are in that volume, and I have a chapter at the end of the book on natural theology that is about a comprehensive cumulative case for theism in response to Hume. And so I agree. I think that there are many ways in which those two volumes could be used together to provide someone with a nice, strong basis for responding to contemporary skepticism.
All right, so now some questions about miracles. How do we define miracles?
Well, I would say that a miracle is a counter-instance to a law of nature. So it's an event that occurs in the course of human history or the history of the natural world, but it occurs not in accordance with the normal, ordinary operation of the laws of nature. And the second component here is it is an act of God. So the agent of the event, the cause of the event is God, and it is an event that when described and developed and explained properly, cannot be explained in terms of the laws of nature. That's what I think a miracle is.
Do you think that the Christian can argue from miracles to God?
Well, I know that it's been done, and of course I have very good friends who are confident of that strategy. One would be William Lane Craig, another would be Gary Habermas. My own view is a little more skeptical about that possibility because of the day in which we live. I think that we need more than just historical evidence for the resurrection to have confidence that God exists. Now, I also believe that we have more evidence of the kind that we need, and so this isn't a problem for us. And I believe that people like Craig and Habermas will admit or acknowledge, I shouldn't say admit, I should say acknowledge, that yes, there are many ways to develop the case for God's existence. But they would say that this is one of those ways, that you can do it just with the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus alone. And I'm skeptical about that.
Now, would you take the view that in concert with other arguments for the existence of God, that seeing that you have other evidences around you, say that cumulative case, and then, boom, there you have some pretty good evidence for a miracle, then it would be effective, but, say, standing on its own, it's hard to interpret how that would point to, say, the God of the Bible?
Yeah, let's put it this way. The evidence, the historical evidence that Jesus Christ, a historical figure of some 2,000 years ago, literally bodily rose from the dead, is strong as such. It's strong as historical evidence. But there's a problem with it, understood that way, and that is that it's evidence for an event that has not been otherwise seen to occur in history. It's an anomaly, or it's what you might call a singularity in history. And my view is that historians generally work in the realm of repeatable experiences, so that the confidence in the evidence they have for drawing the conclusions that they do depends in part on being able to see patterns for events of the same kind and their recurrence within that sort of pattern framework. But if the resurrection of Jesus is unitary, it's a singularity, it's the only event of its kind that's ever happened, then the historian is not really in a very good position to say, well, this is what we're talking about. It's reasonable to make the inference that this has happened because, after all, we've seen this sort of thing happen before under these same sorts of conditions. You see the problem there. On my view, that's the problem, because that's just how historical research is done. Now, most historians work using various kinds of assumptions about human psychology, about other historical facts, about sociology, even, of course, about archaeology, and even in the realm of metaphysics and epistemology or ontology, so that a naturalist who's a historian will probably be very skeptical about any inference to the literal resurrection of Jesus, even though the historical evidence is very strong. And you can see why. If they're naturalists, they're really not sure how that could possibly happen. On the other hand, a theist might say, well, it's reasonable to believe that it could happen because God does exist after all, and so miracles are possible. And if we have, and there is evidence that other miracles have happened, take the history of Judaism, for example, out of the Hebrew Scriptures, we've got various miracles to refer to from actual history. It's not so extraordinary that God might have performed this miracle, and so it is reasonable to infer that a miracle happened, just given the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. But in both of those cases, what's making the difference is someone's general worldview, a decision that's already been made about whether or not there is a God who's in charge of the universe. The naturalist saying there isn't, the theist saying, well, there is. So that still leaves the question, well, what if you abstract from worldview commitments altogether and you just try to do history neutrally, and you just try to understand what the sort of worldview implications are for the historical evidence for the resurrection? Now you're in neutral territory, and I don't think the historian by himself can just settle the issue in favor of, yes, the resurrection happened, and therefore God exists. On the other hand, if you have good independent reason to think that God does exist and might well have an incentive to perform a miracle, and a miracle of a certain type with a certain objective in mind, and then you see those conditions satisfied in actual historical data, then you're in a position to make the inference that it was a miracle that occurred, that provides added confirmation of the hypothesis that God exists, falling back on background evidence for God's existence, and now maybe focusing your understanding of what God is about in the world through this evident miracle, in this case, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, that was all saying a lot in one or two sentences, and if you'd like, we can unpack that.
Well, I did want to ask you a question along that line, and that is about the role of background beliefs and people accepting evidence. How do you think, can you talk more about how background beliefs predispose someone to accept miracle evidence or not?
Okay. Well, let's distinguish between background beliefs and background evidence. A belief is a mental state that someone has regarding a proposition. It's one of affirming the proposition. And a person might come to a knowledge claim or a truth claim or some novel evidence that they've never encountered before with beliefs already in place about certain things, right? So a person already believes certain definite propositions when she hears for the first time the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, regardless of the plausibility of her beliefs, maybe they're well-grounded in evidence, maybe they're not, but these are things she believes. That is bound to some degree to influence how she is going to think about this new evidence and these new claims for the resurrection of Jesus. So if she's a naturalist, that is, she believes that there is no God and that the universe is a closed system with nothing supernatural involved in the events of human history, then with those beliefs intact, she's going to be suspicious of claims that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and of purported evidence that this really did happen. So her beliefs are going to predispose her against accepts kind of evidence and these kinds of claims. On the other hand, if you have background beliefs about God's existence of the other sort, where you believe that God does exist and God is a personal being who is interested in human beings and will intervene in human history, even violate the laws of nature if that's what it takes to perform a miracle to achieve his purposes, then that's all fine. Then a person with that kind of conviction hears of evidence that some miracle has happened, and he may have a predisposition to accept that, or at least he's in a much better position to be open to that. Now that's having a background belief, you might say. Background evidence, though, is when you have support for what you believe, good reason to believe the things that you believe when you come to something new, some new claim, some new evidence. And so it isn't enough just to say, well, I believe God exists, so I'm open to the possibility of miracles, or I believe that God does not exist, so I'm skeptical. The question is, should you be open or not, and on what basis? And that's where background evidence is so important. So I think that there is very strong background evidence for the existence of God. This is evidence that the universe had a beginning, required a cause, and required a cause that could bring the universe into existence out of nothing. That would require, I think, a divine kind of cause. A being that also could explain the design features that we encounter in this physical universe that had a beginning. So you have evidence of design, you have evidence of the origin of the universe. This is background evidence that God exists. It's background evidence in the sense that when you come to a claim that now God has performed a miracle, it's evidence that works in the background to provide you with a reason to think that maybe there is a God who could do such a thing. And now you could look at the new evidence that God has done such a thing with a greater confidence that that's a real possibility and that you're not. It's not just wishful thinking if you accept the miracle claim.
So, in a sense, the background evidence is like some weight is already on the scale, and then when the new information comes, it sort of tips the scale all the way.
Yes, but it can do several things. When the new information comes along, one thing it does is add weight to the evidence for the existence of God. So you've already got evidence for theism with the origin of the universe, the design of the universe, the moral character of human experience, human consciousness. We could develop the evidence for God's existence in lots of interesting and rich ways, even before we come to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Now then, when we have historical evidence for the miracle claim, we have additional evidence that God does exist, because now we have historical evidence that God has done something in the world that only God could do. So yes, that's one of the things accomplished by this evidence. It's this new resurrection evidence is not excess evidence. It's not evidence we don't benefit from. It's evidence that actually contributes to our confidence that God exists. Second, it contributes to our knowledge of what God is up to in the world. Whereas the other evidence from the origin of the universe, design, consciousness, mind, and ethics and all of that tells us there's a God and tells us something about what God is like. None of that tells us what God is like in the way that the evidence of the resurrection does, because that's evidence that God is doing something in the world that is very specific to the message of Jesus Christ about what is needed to reconcile us to God. And then the third thing, of course, is that it confirms the message of Christianity. The resurrection of Jesus is new evidence for something altogether new, and that is that Christianity is true, that it isn't just the case that God exists, but that God is revealed in Jesus Christ. So, yes, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is it compounds the case for theism and provides a crucial link in the case for Christian theism over against alternative versions of theism.
So far we've been talking about evidence that's not directly, you're not in direct contact with, say, some of this evidence. It could be historical evidence or eyewitness testimony. But what do you think about the evidential power, or perhaps, for the lack of a better word, the power of direct experience? If someone directly experiences a miracle, do you think that that has the possibility, say, to take someone from, well, I don't believe that God exists, boom, they experience for themselves a miracle, say they're healed or they see a miracle of some sort. You know, you hear of stories where there's a conversion there. They go from totally believing one thing to a complete paradigm shift, a worldview exchange based upon that direct experience of a miracle. What do you think the difference is there? And in a sense, aren't you going from miracles to God in that sort of instance?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, because I think when you're talking about personal experience, it isn't just from miracles to God that you might be reasoning, but it also might be that there's a kind of direct experience of God that you're having that provides you with reason to believe. And this direct experience of God is accompanied by awareness of a miracle, say of healing in your own body or something like that. And so it isn't just a matter of taking evidence that a miracle has occurred and then making the inference that God exists. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not historical evidence, right? It's not historical evidence based on the testimony of another person, like it is in the case of the resurrection of Jesus. So it's evidence, I take it from what you've said, it's evidence that an individual has directly that no one else has in the same way, and it does not depend upon the testimony of others, much less the testimony of people living, say, 2,000 years ago. It's a personal experience that the individual has had. And it includes a kind of sense, a consciousness of the presence of God in their lives in some peculiar way. And that is a much more complicated kind of case, where miracle seems to enter into the total mix of evidence that an individual has for the presence of God in his or her life. And I believe that that's correct, that a person in a position like that could very well have reason to go from believing that there is no God, or from being indifferent about the question, does God exist, to believing with real conviction that God does exist.
All right, well, that's helpful. What about miracle claims from other religions? Do you think that they minimize the evidential value of Christian miracle claims?
I don't think that miracle claims from other religions constitute miracle claims in the same sense that the miracle claims of Christians do. There is a chapter in our book, In Defense of Miracles, that discusses this very question. What about miracle claims within other religions? And in my study of non-Christian religions, I would say that there really are few, if any, miracle claims of the same sort. Now, part of this is because of the way I understand what a miracle is as in relationship to the nature of a law of nature. And part of it has to do with my understanding of the significance of theism as a context in which to understand the concept of a miracle. So let me explain those 2 points. If a non-Christian religion has a worldview that's pantheistic, for example, say a Hindu or a variety of Buddhist or other kind of pantheistic worldview, where the laws of nature are understood very differently than we do here in the Western world in the tradition of modern science, where these are laws that govern the behavior of the physical world, and that the physical world is real and not illusory, then a miracle, on my view, has to be understood in relationship to that concept of a natural law. So according to modern science, you might say, laws of nature govern the behavior of actually existing physical things that are not spiritual in their nature. This would be different than a pantheistic view of the world. So it would be different than the Hindu view, for example, or any other pantheistic view of reality. So now what would a miracle be if there are no laws of nature of the sort that we normally think of in Western science? Well, it would be something very different than what a Christian miracle is. A Christian miracle really is something that either suspends or violates or acts in contradistinction to the normal operation of the laws of nature. I have no problem thinking of miracles as violations of the laws of nature in the sense that God does something that would not have happened if he had just let things happen in accordance with the laws of nature. So he intervenes and interrupts their operation in some supernatural way, whether we can see it or not, whether we can recognize it or not. Now, I don't think a pantheistic view of the world has the right concept of a law of nature to make sense of miracle that way. So no Hindu or other pantheistic miracle claim, so-called, would be a miracle claim in the same sense that the Christian miracle claim of the resurrection is. With the resurrection of Jesus, you have what I'll call a violation of the laws of nature governing the decay of dead bodies. Jesus Christ comes back to life. That's just not how things happen in accordance with the laws of nature. Laws of nature understood in a very modern Western scientific sense, if you like. But if you have a pantheistic view of the world, then you might say, well, that's the sort of thing that can happen, and everything's physical is illusory anyway, and so what is a law of nature? Now, the other concept is the concept of God. If a miracle is an act of God, then your worldview has got to affirm the existence of God if you're going to have a miracle. And pantheism, just taking another example, affirms the existence of God only insofar as God is a kind of force that permeates everything that happens and that is real. So nothing really is any different than God and God's activity, and so there would be nothing to qualify as a miracle in that respect either. Now, theism affirms the distinctive existence of God in contrast to the physical universe and everything else that exists. God created the universe, transcends the universe, but could operate within the universe either through providence or through an overt miracle. And non-Christian religions like Islam are theistic. So what about their miracle claims? Well, then you have to look at the claims themselves. And the really singular miracle claim that Islam makes on its own behalf is the production of the Quran. This is the singular miracle of Muhammad's own religion, is that the revelation that he received in the form of the Quran was received in this miraculous way, and that the Quran is so self-attestating, so self-attesting, so self-authoritative as the divine word of God that that is to be attributed to the fact that it is itself a production of God by miraculous means. There are a couple of other miracles that they make mention of, such as the transporting of Muhammad from one location to another all of a sudden, but those are trivial and not made central to their religious tradition in the way that their claim about the Quran is. And that is a claim that's very hard to sustain. There's really no historical evidence, right, that you could refer to that would say, oh, yes, you're right, this looks like something that God produced through dictation to Muhammad when Muhammad was recording the Quran. The Quran actually wasn't produced so straightforwardly in that way. And even if it were, we have no independent historical evidence that that's how it happened. All we have is the claim that it happened. That would be like saying Jesus Christ rose from the dead, but we have no evidence for it. And so that's a long way around your question. Well, do non-Christian miracle claims hinder the strength of the evidence for Christian miracle claims? And if we're comparing their claims insofar as they make claims with the Christian claim that Jesus rose from the dead, I'd say there's no potential even for those to detract from the strength of the evidence for the central miracle claim of Christianity.
Now, sometimes the skeptic will say something along the lines of, oh, you believe all these miracles in the Bible, but you just reject all the other miracles claims from other religions just out of hand. This is a double standard. And how should the Christian respond to that? What's the proper way to think through that objection?
I would say compare the evidence. Just simply take the evidence I would start with the resurrection of Jesus. And I would say consider the evidence for that and show me what is the comparable evidence for any single miracle claim in any other religious tradition, and just start there. Most people who say that sort of thing are not really that familiar with the evidence for any particular religion, whether it's the miracle evidence within any particular religion, whether it's Christianity or a non-Christian religion. So I think that what you simply have to do there is, instead of trying to answer the question by presenting a bunch of evidence, is you have to ask the critic or the skeptic to develop their own criticism a little bit more fully. You have to say, well, now, just exactly what do you think the evidence is with regard to these various miracle claims? Why do you think that they're on a par?
So sometimes it may be the case that that's just a canned response, and the Christian should look to dig a little bit deeper. Now, how should the Christian respond to miracle claims today, whether it's from, say, Christian testimonies or other religions? You hear about healings, you hear about people that are deaf hearing again, or even people being raised from the dead in another country. How do you respond to that, and how would you encourage people to think through those things that they would hear?
That's a great question. Let me come back to just one thing you said before you asked the question, and that was about canned responses. I really appreciate the point. We have to be careful about providing canned responses to questions. But what exactly is a canned response? I think it probably is supposed to be one that is kind of hollow, pretty shallow, one that an individual maybe hasn't thought through very carefully himself, that sort of thing. And it's supposed to just be obvious that it settles the issue, when maybe it isn't so obvious. We have to be careful not to do that in our own engagement with the culture. On the other hand, we also have to be discerning when that happens coming from the other side. And so many times these questions, these objections, are formed in such a way that they seem to press the Christian believer to come up with a good argument, but on close examination, they haven't provided enough of an objection to compel the Christian to respond on their terms yet. So, for example, when somebody says, well, if you believe in God, then I want to know, why is there evil in the world? What about that? What about evil? And And I think the first response is to say, well, what about evil? What is it about evil that you think constitutes an obstacle to rational belief in God? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't one. There isn't a real issue there. It just means that the person who says there is needs to make definite and clear what that problem is so that you know what you're dealing with in a particular case. So now when a person says, well, what about non-Christian religions and their miracle claims? What do you have to say about those? I think the proper response initially is to say, well, what about them? What do you know about them? Why do you think that they create a problem for Christian belief? And so you just draw the person out to say more fully what he or she thinks is the real objection to Christianity. Otherwise, we dive into a detailed response to something that may not even be touching on the real objection that they are raising. So that's just a strategic point that I would emphasize.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to claims that miracles happen today, Christians are claiming that a miracle has happened at their church or with somebody they know or personally or maybe another part of the world, and they're hearing testimonies to that effect. You're asking the question, how should people think about those kinds of claims? Do you mean people who don't believe that God exists or that aren't Christians or that don't believe in miracles?
Basically asking, what should one's attitude be as far as their level of skepticism or willingness to believe or not a claim, whether it be from Christian sources or non-Christian sources, that there's been some sort of miracle that's taken place? How would one examine those claims and maybe search them out?
I think that the question goes right to the point. They should examine them and search them out until they have good reason to believe that they have occurred. Even if they're believers and they believe that God is active in the world for causing miracles to occur of various kinds, when they hear a particular miracle claim, they should consider the source of the claim, the evidence that they themselves have that the claim is true, evidence that is presented by the person making the claim that it's true, and all of that. And if they're in a position to weigh that evidence and see for themselves on the strength of that evidence that it's likely that a miracle has occurred, then it's rational for them to believe that a miracle has occurred in that case. But I think, it's just as reasonable, in fact more reasonable probably, to withhold judgment and simply be agnostic and say, well, I don't know if a miracle happened in that case or not. Now, what difference does that make? I think a lot of people would like to believe that miracles do occur and have a predisposition to accept testimonial evidence that may not be as strong as it should be to be confident that a particular claim is really true. If a friend of mine and I are talking and I have great confidence in the character of the individual, all right, he manifests the fruit of the Spirit, he tells the truth, he's a person that I can trust intrinsically, because of the long experience I've had with the individual. This isn't just somebody that I happen to respect from a distance because of his leadership in the church or something like that, but this is somebody I know personally and have known for a long time. I know his strengths and his weaknesses through long relationship. And he recounts an experience while being in some other part of the country, observing some things that have happened. And he tells me that he believed that a miracle happened. Then I think I have a stronger reason to believe that that really did happen than if I go to a meeting somewhere and somebody who is maybe a well-known leader in the Christian church reports something of the same sort. I don't have the same evidence in his case, listening in that case, for believing that the miracle actually happened. And yet it could be. The evidence that I have doesn't determine whether the miracle happened. It just determines whether or not it's reasonable for me to believe that it happened.
All right, one more question about miracles. What role do you think a good defense of miracles should play in the apologist's toolkit, so to speak?
Well, Christianity depends upon the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection lies at the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If Jesus has not been raised, said Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, then our faith is in vain. The game is over. There's not much point to being Christian if you have no confidence in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you're going to have a rational conviction of the truth of Christian belief, and that's going to depend upon having evidence, then it's going to require having evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. This is evidence that I think we do have, and that we have to such a degree that warrants belief that it happened. But it's evidence that is strengthened by the background evidence that God exists, that He is interested in the human condition, and that He wants to rescue humanity from its plight, and purports to do so through the prophet Jesus Christ, and demonstrates that Jesus is His own prophet with His own authentic means of salvation by raising Him from the dead. I think we cannot do without that. So it's important that we be familiar, we be thoroughly schooled in the evidence both for the existence of God and for the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
You teach at Biola and Talbot, and those are two universities that graduate a lot of philosophy students and apologetics students each year. So what advice would you have for this next generation of Christian apologists?
Well, it's true that we have been blessed with many good students who are especially interested in Christian thought, Christian apologetics, and Christian philosophy. I'd say about 100 of my own former students have gone on to do PhD research in philosophy. And so a great need is being filled for faculty across this country and the nation, the world really, with thoughtful Christian philosophers who will teach not only in the area of philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics, but in every dimension of Christian philosophy. We need scholars in the sciences doing the same sort of thing, and in all of the humanities. It's hard to give general advice other than to say that the church today is waging a kind of internal struggle about the value of evidence and whether or not we need to be that rooted and grounded in evidence as a community of faith. So many today are saying that reasons to believe and evidence are not important, that what's more important is that we come together in a kind of community and life together, and we construct a story about what it means to be Christian, and then we tell that story to the world through the various missional actions that we perform. And while all of that is well and good, I don't think it's adequate. I think we have a message to preach, and we have to give reasonable people reasons to believe that the message is true. And so whoever you are as a Christian, whether you're a university student or a university teacher, whether you're a high school person or a grandmother, whether you're a parent or a child, whatever your walk in life, whatever your vocation, wherever you are in the world, you have a calling from the Scripture as a person created in the image of God to be an ambassador for Jesus Christ, to be a minister of reconciliation to others in the world. And that's going to include, to the best of your ability, presenting reasonable people with good reasons to believe the same things that you believe that have brought about your own salvation. And so, yes, I think that we all should be the best students that we can be within the limits of our own circumstances, of the evidence that Jesus Christ claimed to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world, and that He was right in claiming that this is true.
Now, as we begin to wrap up here, would you mind pointing our listeners to your blog and where some of your resources can be found online?
Well, Brian, my blog is a kind of open-ended blog. It's not limited to Christian apologetics. I do lots of other things in there. I review film, and I put film discussion guides online, And I recently have posted slide presentations for talks I've given on topics in Christian apologetics. But I comment on things going on in the world of politics and so forth. So anybody who comes to my blog is welcome to just browse. But it's kind of an open-ended forum for all kinds of discussion about all kinds of things. I discuss fiction and other things I'm reading and so forth. So I wouldn't want anybody listening to think that if they come to my blog, it's just strictly about that, Christian apologetics and things we've been talking about. They might be disappointed. The address for that is just douggeivett.com. But I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I can be reached in those ways, and I'm always happy to hear from people with any questions they have. If they would like to pose a question at the blog, either on a page where I posted something that interests them, or if they just want to go to the author page and post a question for me and start a discussion about something, whether it's in Christian apologetics or something else, that's a great way to get in touch with me, and I'm pretty good at staying up to date on that on a daily basis.
Well, Doug, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Brian, thank you for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to share a perspective on how best to reason about our faith.
We've been speaking with Doug Geivett. Be sure to check out all his books and resources and his blog. They'll be all linked today at the blog post at Apologetics315. If you've enjoyed this interview, please share it with others. And if you like, leave a review in iTunes, where you can also find dozens more interviews with Christian apologists. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.